of my favorites, and I haven't done it in some time. It was brought up by one of my staff and looking back through the old archives and finding one. I think it's one of my favorite because it's one of the first concepts that I thought about so often in doing work, family therapy between parent and children in the wilderness. And I think it speaks to a really fundamental idea and concept in our relationship with other people. In this case, in this context, of course, I'm going to be talking a lot about the parent to the child, and I'm speaking to parents primarily, but it really does lend itself well to other relationships, other examples. I think we're all familiar with the phrase sexual objects, sexual objectification. That's a common term, and I'm going to, of course, expand that to mean much beyond that. But there's a lesson to take from that concept that I wanted to share with you tonight. I was in a dream interpretation class in college, in graduate school, and I remember at one point we were analyzing and interpreting common dreams, and the professor made the comment that, in a dream, sex isn't sex. And I thought about that for a minute, and of course it rang true. I believe that most things in our dreams are symbolic of other ideas, processes, concepts, and so forth. But as I thought about it, I thought, sex isn't about sex when you're awake, right? It's about other things. Good sex, bad sex is about other things. There's this idea, you've heard it said, that rape, for example, is not about sex. It's about aggression and domination and other things. But in a way that's not all accurate, because we would be more accurate to say that rape is the ultimate of bad sex, where one person is treating another person without feeling, without respect, without empathy, without understanding, without reciprocity, in a powerless position. And yes, there's anger and rage and control in it, but we're all in that continuum, right? We've all had situations in our lives, whether it be around money or around sex or around even parenting, where we fail to see the other. We fail to have empathy. We fail to spend time listening and being concerned about them. Of course, in the sexual relationship between partners, the more shared it is, the less power is there, the better it is, right? In fact, in intimacy and relationships, there is an idea that where there is power present, intimacy is compromised. And that's a fascinating idea when you think about the parent and child relationship, because inherently there's a hierarchy in parenting, right? This is not a democracy. Of course, as your children grow up and as they age over time, they're given more and more freedom, but it's not a democracy. So it's important for us to understand the implications of power in a relationship and power in a relationship with a child. I'm going to talk about that a lot tonight because I think there's a misuse of power, right? I think that there are times, for example, and I'll get to this, when parents assess the anger of the child to mean that something's wrong with them, when it could just be that they're angry, right? Anger at a parent is not a valid measure of an individual's mental health. In fact, it might be a measure of their depth of feeling, some kind of justified emotional reaction, an assessment of how powerless they feel, so forth and so on. So we can borrow that idea of sexual objectification and what we know about it in popular culture, and we can expand on it to understand what objectification means more fully in non-sexual relationships. To objectify someone is to treat them like a thing, right? Without feeling. And that is to say that we don't sense their feeling, we're not sensitive to it, we don't have an empathic response to it, to another person's feeling. We treat them as if they are a rock. Many people, a lot of us, are so compromised by our empathic antenna that we're overwhelmed by it, right? That we are at times compromised because we're taking in too much. And there's no differentiation. And as I say in my book, where there is no differentiation, no separation, there still is a loss of the other. So a lack of objectification is about increasing in awareness in self, increasing in your own project, your own journey, your own differentiation. That's the foundation of it. Another key ingredient is learning how to feel. Because like I say, the more one is a feeling creature, the more able they are to sense and see feelings in other people. And think about that as a parent. It's useful and valuable. But think about that as a child. The more that a child's feelings are regarded, not necessarily always catered to, not always do they have to change us. In fact, there's a good deal of theory and idea that if we change, we capitulate in the face of our child's feelings all the time, again, that we're in a compromised relationship. It's okay for us to just hold them. It's okay for a young child or even an older child to throw a tantrum or be upset about something, and for us to just see them and see them with patience, with curiosity, with empathy, and with sensitivity, not to the point that, of course, it compromises our boundaries. So there's a lack of empathy, a lack of connection, a lack of reciprocity in an objectified situation, a relationship that has objectification. It's moving from an I-it relationship to an I-I. You know, I see you essentially. It's hard to escape this idea that I see you essentially as a similar animal to me, right? You look the same, 2 eyes in the front, 2 ears on the side. So you must be somewhat like me, somewhere in the range of what I am. And so, to the extent that, again, I can have my own awareness of self, develop an authentic self, you know, do battle with the false self to get rid of and let go of that and become more authentic, the more I can regard you, the more I can see you in the process. So our vision increases, our hearing increases, our sensitivity increases, our empathy increases. Somebody that treats others like an object has very little remorse. And it's a simple idea, right? If I'm hurting a feelingless thing, a rock, you know, imagine taking a crowbar to a rock. If I'm hitting a rock, I have no remorse about it because the rock has no feelings. So they essentially see other people as non-feeling creatures. And I'll talk about the development of it because there's some really, really cool take-home ideas in the development of objectification. And you know, we talk about it at the extreme end of somebody that's a predator or abusive or violent. We talk about that extreme end. But we can also talk about it at the very mild and everyday end of things, and the way that we do this to our children. Manipulation, control, and it's a power-based relationship. And again, it's not unusual or extreme when we think about the everyday examples. I'm going to describe a cycle, the way that it develops. And again, remember that this principle applies to extreme examples of violent criminals, but also applies to us as everyday parents. And there's wisdom that we can take from those extreme examples that can inform us in our everyday experiences. So for somebody to become somebody who objectifies people, this is the process. They experience some kind of hurt, some kind of pain. To cope with it, they learn to escape it, to not feel. This can be done in all sorts of ways, right? Through self-medication, through disassociation, right? It can be an intellectual process that doesn't require taking chemicals. It can be cutting on yourself. It can be, you know, developing depression, to not feel, to dampen it, all of those things. So one learns not to feel. And like I said earlier, one sees others as essentially the same kind of creatures themselves. So if I don't hurt, then you don't hurt. If I don't feel, then you don't feel. And so then I am not hurting anybody else. I'm not in touch with that part of my own humanity, so I can't see that humanity in somebody else. And so when we do treatment with people that are on that extreme end, the antisocial end, and you know, teenagers are not, none of the teenagers that we deal with are on that extreme end, but you know, they approach some of these ways. The solution isn't to lecture them about guilt, to teach them necessarily about empathy. See how you make other people feel. The doorway in to that person is, how are you feeling? And when one learns to feel, it has a universal application to all feeling creatures. So when you're treating antisocial people, when you're treating non-empathic, people, narcissists. When you're treating them, you're teaching them how to feel. And that really is, isn't it, the core, a core tenet of all therapy is learning how to feel, tolerate feeling, be with one's feelings. The expressing of one's feelings, which happens in a lot of therapies, is just an operationalized, right? It's how we learn to feel, is by expressing it. It's not intuitive or satisfying, right? We want people to feel guilty for what they've done to other people, whether it be the extreme examples that I described, or our teenagers or young adults who have hurt us or hurt the family. We want them to see the impact on other people. But due to shame, due to the barrier, the defense, walking in that particular door can oftentimes have the effect that they become more and more walled off to it, right? It's too overwhelming for me to do that to begin with. So you start off with questions like, how did you feel this morning? How did you feel when you got that letter? How did you feel when you got your first fire? How did you feel when so-and-so was rude to you earlier? How did you feel in our last session, right? You're just teaching them how to feel, teaching them how to fish, as it were, rather than giving them the answers, the fish, so to speak. So that's the process. It looks like this. Hurt, developmentally speaking, hurt, a series of hurt, a trauma, a persistent experience in childhood where the feelings of the child weren't noticed, seen, held, valued, right? For some clients that I've worked with, for some parents that I've worked with, some adults, they don't really have a sense of their childhood, right? They don't know what went on. It's almost like it's invisible to them, or underwater, murky, they can't see it. One of the ideas in that process is perhaps you weren't listened to and seen and regarded, because if you're listened to and seen, it's alive. If you're not listened to and seen, it's like it's not happening. You're dismissed, you're erased. So how you are considered is how you come to consider yourself. And of course, that has wonderful application to us as children, but of course, it also has wonderful application to us as parents of children. So there's a hurt, there's a trauma, could be big, could be small, could be chronic, could be anywhere in between. The learning not to feel, the being told not to feel, being talked out of our feelings, having our feelings or dilemmas fixed instead of just heard and empathized with, because our parents lack the empathic capacity to sit with it, right? It's hard for any of us to watch our children hurt or struggle. We treat that as a problem to be avoided or to be gotten around, instead of just saying, we can sit with you in the struggle. And that is, for some of us, that's hard. For some of us, it's impossible nearly. So we learn not to feel. We get reinforced. We get told not to feel by the pep talks, by the analysis, by the answers, by the suggestions, by the look on the bright side speeches, right? We respond to peer pressure, and our parents tell us, don't worry what other people think about you, instead of saying, it's hard, isn't it? I can see that. Sometimes I struggle with it. So we learn not to feel. We get told not to feel. We become an unfeeling creature. We see others like ourselves. We're capable then of hurting other people, being insensitive to other people, and because things don't require empathy, right? So that cycle goes on through development. So let's talk about parenting concepts. Let's talk about some myths versus some truths. Let's talk about some practical take-home messages as we go forward. So in parenting, if your child's success or failure becomes a reflection of your competency, of your goodness, of your esteem, they then become an object, right? If their success, getting into Harvard, whatever it is, you know, being a great singer or dancer, being beautiful, objectively speaking, of course, if those kinds of things are a measure and reflection, if that makes you proud, there is a piece of objectification. You're not seeing them as a self that you are here to support and help them go forward, but they are a reflection. They become virtually a mirror for you, right? You see yourself in them. And a lot of this, I keep hearing ideas and concepts from the book Parenting from the Inside Out, where Daniel Siegel, and many of you know him, Daniel Siegel says it's almost as if literally the parent experiences the child's success as their success. And I would suspect that all of us have some of this. I don't know that I've ever encountered a parent who has none of it. Some have less, some have more. And even if their anger is about you, right? I remember I've told the story where a mother wrote what I thought was a well-coached letter. It was well-coached because I did it. But I thought she received the coaching well. And she wrote this really assertive and clear letter to her son with questions and challenges to some of the things that he was doing and saying. They were kind and loving, but honest and authentic. They weren't punitive. And her son got very angry. When I got on the phone call with her for that week, she said, I wrote a horrible letter. And I said, well, what makes you think that? And she said, well, look at what happened with my son. And I said, that's not an indication of how well you did as a letter in your letter writing, right? And we can think of that. We can also empathize with her that sometimes we measure ourselves, the rightness or the wrongness of what we do by how others react to us, right? It's probably what makes us, it's probably part of our evolutionary path, right? We had to be in groups, work together in groups, because by ourselves as humans, we're a pretty pathetic creature, but in groups, we're pretty fantastic. So it probably comes from there. It also comes from our own childhood, our own parenting, our own idea that our parents implanted into us that when they were upset with us, it was about us, right? When they got proud of us, it was about us. When they got disappointed in us, it was about us. When they were angry or frustrated or worried or anxious about us, it was towards us, it was about us, and it wasn't. Not necessarily. That was them. So their successes and failures are your successes and failures. I talk about this idea from the book, The Narcissistic Dilemma. Or I'm sorry, it's actually called The Narcissistic Epidemic. I wrote Dilemma, but it's Narcissistic Epidemic, where this idea that previous generations of parents in families, that children worried about what their parents thought about them. And in today's generations, it's kind of a cliche that parents worry what their children think about them. If that's generally true in our society, generationally true in our society, then it's the same person who's doing the worrying, right? If you grew up believing, experiencing, being told even overtly that when your parents felt something, it was about you, then your brain is getting wired to believe that. The characters in the play, the drama, change, right? You become older and get gray hair. For some of us, it falls out. Get wrinkles, but we're still measuring ourselves by what other people think. So that's one of these fundamental, I think, errors in our entire process in our society. This idea, specifically in parenting, but every relationship, is what somebody else thinks about me is about me. What somebody else thinks about me is my business, right? It's really the seeds in the beginning of peer pressure. So many parents are, I think, so frustrated, overwhelmed, saddened by the extent to which their children are affected and controlled by peer pressure. Well, in many ways, that began with us. And I use this example. If I go to my daughter, for example, telling her I'm disappointed or I'm hurt or I'm worried or I'm sad, whatever it is, and my intent is to get her then to change her behavior so that I'm not those things. Right? I wire her to believe that it's her job to take care of my feelings. And then she goes out there in the world, say she has a boyfriend, young teenager. I'm giving one example of peer pressure. You could think of numberless examples. And the boyfriend says to my daughter, I want to have sex. And she says, I don't want to, or I'm not ready, or I'm nervous. And the boyfriend says, but I love you and you're hurting me. And I'm so sad. And I'm frustrated. And I'm disappointed. And I'm embarrassed, right? The same wiring that's in her brain, it's moved from father to boyfriend, from parent to peer group, but it's the same exact wiring. There's not a differentiation on that basic structural level in the brain. It's the same kind of lack of differentiation. Parents who ask the question, what could I have done? You know, I think that's, in one context, that's a fantastic question. It's probably one that swirls around all of the work that I do with you all. But there is in that question sometimes evidence of, it's about me. I could have done it right. I could have fixed it. The failure or the success is mine. It's a different question to say every day, what could I do differently? How can I be better? Than to ask that in the question of, my child turned out with an addiction. What did I do wrong? A child turned out with depression. What did I do wrong? Yes, those disorders, those diseases do ask of us to ask difficult questions of ourselves, but one of those is to make that separation, to become accountable, aware, enlightened, make our life a project, but not measured by outcomes. I heard a funny, when I was in London last week, I heard a funny line in a play that I watched. There was a dialogue, and at one point they were discussing history, and it was the play was set in present day, and one of the actors said to one of the other actors, so what do you think about the French Revolution? Do you think it was a good thing? And the other actor said, too soon to tell. And I love that, because this idea of outcomes, right? We pay so much attention to outcomes, but that's an objectifying thing. See, the light switch on my wall over there is an object. I can turn it on and off. It doesn't have feelings, doesn't have its own responses, its own agency. I control it. Control is a huge piece of objectification, right? I can engineer you. I can create you into something. I can mold you into something. That's objectification. It leaves out the agency, the self in the other person. It dishonors it. It doesn't honor it in the process. And outcomes are about that. The whole shift that we're trying to make in this process is moving from outcomes to self-awareness. So that's why the questions, what should I do in this situation? What should I do in that situation? Are typically not, almost always not, the right question to ask. The right question to ask is, what is my truth? What do I feel? What do I want? What's my intention in this relationship? And what's the most effective way at acting in a way that's consistent with that truth? If my goal is long-term relationship, if my goal is to be in a healthy relationship, my goal is to model authenticity, to be authentic, then all of those questions get answered automatically in line with that. But I did all of that, parents will tell me, in a certain situation, or more generally in the raising of the child. Again, in that statement, it suggests that if I do A, it equals B. That's treating somebody like an object. We know, and you can imagine very easily the idea that children grow up to be wonderful, compassionate, amazing people. And some of them have really rough childhoods, maybe even abusive situations, but they become social workers, and they dedicate their lives to saving the world. We can also imagine where people had good enough parenting, and they end up making choices that hurt other people. So it's not a simple cause and effect relationship. We can talk about these dynamics. We can talk about contributions. We can talk about impact and influence, but to boil it down to cause and effect, to measure decisions in terms of outcomes, turns the other into an object. I was talking to a heroin addict several years ago in the field, and he was absolutely riddled with shame, right? Believed that he had ruined his family, that he was good for nothing, caused them all kinds of grief, told me how they were good people, and I came to know them, and they are good people. They have sincere hearts, they're loving, they work on themselves, they're open, they're humble, they're good people. And I was talking to him about this idea of objectification and shame. And I said to him as an example, I said, you know, for example, if my daughter got into Harvard, I wouldn't have the inclination to necessarily be proud of her, right? And in this way of thinking. And it was the first time in the session that he looked at me in the eyes. He looked at me and he said, "Nobody thinks that way." And I said, "Some people very much approach thinking that way, not having the inclination to be disappointed or proud of another person. If my daughter worked for it and it was her goal, I'd be happy for her. It's definitely something she could be proud of if it was a goal that she set and worked for and accomplished. Absolutely, that's true. And if she failed and struggled at various things, I may be worried and concerned about her, that she's not doing well in her life. All of those things can be true. But it's not really about me. It's not really about what I feel. It's about supporting herself and helping her regard herself. The great example that I heard one time when I was younger, in fact, I think I was in undergrad, and I was a big Bob Dylan fan growing up. And in the early 1990s, Bob Dylan had a son, still does, Jacob Dylan, who was the lead singer of a rock band. I think he still is. And they had a #1 album. And a reporter asked Bob Dylan, "Are you proud of your son? With his success, is what he's doing?" And Bob Dylan said, plain as can be, "It's totally irrelevant." That's what he answered. It's irrelevant to me. And I knew Bob Dylan. I'd followed him, knew of him, read about him, seen interviews of him, and I thought, well, that's just Bob Dylan, being annoyed by reporters. But it came to make sense to me. It didn't matter to him that his son was a huge success or not. That was irrelevant. He just regarded his son as his son, whether he were, working as a street sweeper, or that he were a rock star, or a medical school scholar, right? It wouldn't matter to him. Didn't make a difference. So we can't approach that, and that is called love and connection and attachment. It doesn't feel like it when we grew up in a home where everybody's feelings were so combined, where what somebody said caused a reaction or a trigger, where everybody's feelings were everybody else's responsibility, where authenticity wasn't valued, where dependency and caretaking and codependency was valued and modeled. I talked about already the origin of peer pressure. The story of Midas, the Midas Touch. It really is a story about objectification, about turning people that one touches into objects. And yet one can't be measured by their value like gold, right? If you have this much success, you're more valued and more lovable. But in many ways, children have that experience, right? That if I'm good, I'm more loved. If I'm not good, I'm less loved. I talk about the unlived life of the parent, right? This idea that we need to be at beck and call, that we need to have our lives consumed by our children's life. It's not possible. It's not realistic. And it's not healthy. It's not something to strive for. Absolutely, it is our job to develop capacity to support and be there for our children. But we must be responsible to also take care of ourselves. That idea of the selfless parent, it does many things. One of which is it doesn't give a child space to be upset or frustrated or angry. Right? If I have to be good, then you being angry at me is going to be a threat to that. So I'm going to struggle in whatever way, whatever style it is. I'm going to struggle with you being angry. If I say I do everything for you, that doesn't make any sense. Then essentially, then I'm getting my needs met through you. So then I need certain things of you to be okay. In contrast, if I make my needs my responsibility and I take care of those, then I can be there for you with a full spiritual belly, emotional, psychological belly to help feed you. But if I get my needs met through you, I'm consuming you. It's the consuming parent. This idea, and I used to think it, and I used to, when I was a young therapist, I equated needing with loving. It's not the same thing, and then sometimes it's the exact opposite. Loving is about giving. Loving is about, what can I do for you? How can I help you? But if I need you, that's not necessarily about loving. I do have needs, and I've got to honor those. I've got to feed those. I can ask for things from you, from others, but I'm ultimately responsible for them. Responding to their angers, fears, and blame, right? Developing the capacity that we can hear them more. You know, one of the most important things that I've done with my young adult children, and I've done a version of this with all of my children, but most formally with my young adult children because they were ready for it, but having a session with them, an extended session where they could tell me how I screwed up, how I hurt them. And that was hard to hear. Some of them I could have predicted, but there were some that I couldn't have predicted, and that were really, really hard to hear. I remember my son, when he was getting ready to have his session with me, he had approached his therapist. I may have told you this before. He had approached his therapist, and his therapist said, well, Jake, when you have the session with your dad, for every negative thing you say about your dad, I want you to say a positive thing. And I said, I think you might need a new therapist. And I said, we could go to my therapist if you're open to that, because I promise you, she won't make you say any nice things to me about me. And I don't need that. That's my job, to fill up my esteem, not yours. It's not your job to love me. It's my job to love you. And if you love me, that's wonderful. But as your father, it's my job to support you. It's not your job to take care of me. Managing, controlling their feelings and actions, learning the difference between being responsible for yourself versus being responsible for them, their reactions, feelings, choices. That's a big difference. Walking on eggshells, see this as a form of control. Treating them as fragile is a form of control. Again, you stop being authentic. And where did we learn to stop being authentic? We learned it in our earlier contexts. That's what Alice Miller is talking about in the book, The Drama of the Gifted Child. The gifted part of the title, the gifted child, is the child that can sense what the parent needs, the child gives it to the parent at their own cost, which is their authentic self. They develop a false self because the parent needs them to be a certain way, to feel a certain way. It's part of what I've referred to this before. I'm talking about a book from 1979 that is a landmark, what I believe is the most important book in child development in our generation, and then the movie Inside Out, the cartoon from Pixar, where the daughter is sad about moving from Minnesota, I think, to San Francisco. And when she's sad and upset and pouting, the father said, where did our good little girl go? In other words, if you're happy, you're good. If you're sad, you're bad. We talk about this with babies. A good baby. We use the phrase good baby. Well, he's a really good baby. And what do we mean by that? It means a baby that doesn't cry, that doesn't have needs, that isn't a burden, that is easy to soothe, right? From infancy, we teach people that what they feel, if it's unpleasant or a burden or causes us any kind of angst, it's bad. And we do this all throughout life. And so that's why this work is so counterintuitive. It's so heroic, because we're challenging just assumptions, unconscious lessons that were handed down to us. Taking on their work, their recovery, and becoming the engineer for their success, right? That if I see this when parents get to this point, they've been traumatized by their children's drug abuse, depression, suicidality, whatever it is. I've seen them come to this point and they're like, okay, I'm going to use all of my resources. I'm successful in my professional life. I can get what I get in my professional life when I want it, so I'm going to do it. I'm going to do this to my child. And then they ask me, is this A, B, C, and D okay? And my response is, well, it's not the things. It's this idea that I'm hearing that you think you can do it. That you think you can engineer sobriety or engineer non-depression or whatever it is. And I don't think that will work. I think we're in trouble. Now, let's talk about all of those same choices in the context of your want to be an authentic, clear, assertive, honest, loving, compassionate, patient parent. Then we consider all of those. So it's the thinking that goes into it that becomes the issue. Here's some myths and truths that I came up with. You are only the left side of the column, in case you're not clear. The left side is the myths, and the right side is the truth, and I have them connected by the number. Number one, you are only happy as your happiest child. It's insane. It's an ism that we hear in our culture, because we do love our children, and when they hurt, we hurt. So we take that to mean that this is the highest form of love, the highest form of connection. Conversely, we learn in recovery with somebody who has addiction and mental health issues that your serenity is your responsibility. And notice I used the word serenity. I changed it a little bit. It's a little bit of a cheat. Because yes, if your child is hurting significantly, it's going to hurt. It's going to be hard to be, not going to be happy for you. Nobody is. But being responsible for your well-being, your sense of well-being is yours. Parents who wring their hands, can't sleep, talk about being so upset they can't concentrate. And they tell this to us. Sometimes they tell it to their child, and they think it's an expression of love, and it's not. It's an expression of dependence. And like I've talked about in previous webinars, it actually is experienced by the child as intrusive and overwhelming. And they want to distance themselves from it, because then they have to be something for somebody else instead of working through their own process. Number two, it's your child's job to make you proud, versus how you feel about your child is about you. It's yours to own, right? It's yours to own. I'll talk about it a little bit later, but I think the I feel statements have been misunderstood in our program at times. You know, and I have a cartoon about this in my book, and I talk about this when I teach communication. I feel statements are not for you to give to your children so that they will change. That's not the intent. In fact, as of late, I've come so far to almost say that I would discourage most parents from giving their children I feel statements, because of the intent that is unconscious, that it's your job to then change. So I feel statements are to get clear, right? They're to talk about ownership, to give awareness, but not to get the other person to feel guilty or ashamed or afraid or anxious to change to make us happy. Number three, your child's anger at you is a measure of their mental health. Anger toward parents is normal, healthy. And your job is to contain it. And you know, people will ask, and I wouldn't be surprised if this comes up for some of you, what if the child their expression of anger is inappropriate? Swearing, name calling, aggressive language, even physical violence. And obviously you can have your boundaries, right? And the best way that I can answer that question is to say this. On my best days, when I'm taken care of, I can tolerate quite a bit from my children without it affecting me or hurting me. I'm glad to hear it. If it comes out sloppy, I can hear it. The days when I'm more compromised, more exhausted, more stressed, less bandwidth, then I'll require a more specific expression of their feeling. Sometimes I'll even give them feedback, like it's not okay to talk to me that way. Right? So you get to decide what your bandwidth is, but let's be clear, children need a place to talk about their anger. And to be angry at us, to be angry at you, the power differential is incredible, is a normal and healthy thing. Expanding your capacity in this area would serve everybody. You can get it right, right? This idea that most of us that are trying to get it right grew up in a family where that was the deal, versus no one is perfect, and there's no way not to put your stink on your children, right? You're going to be human. If your children need you to get it right, be perfect, they're doomed. And so that's your work. That's your family of origin legacy. That's going backwards. You have to be right, similar to the previous one, number 5, or versus you only need to be you. It's so much more powerful, assertive, clear, healthy to say this is what I need, rather than to say this is the right way to be. This is how you should be. Right? It's the difference between you messages and I messages. And in the book Nonviolent Communication, Marshall Rosenberg speaks very clearly at the heart of nonviolent communication is talking about what I need versus saying, here's what your problem is. But it's so much easier to talk about somebody else's problems than it is to talk about our needs. Because number one, we have shame about our own needs. Right? It feels vulnerable to express them. When our needs showed up in our childhood and they overwhelmed our parents, we were made to feel like there was something wrong with us. Right? That's going back to that. If our parents had enough capacity to sit with our needs, even our unfulfilled needs, at times, we would have less shame about it. It would be not as vulnerable. What you say to your child, this is myth number 6. What you say to your child becomes their inner voice. And it's not that that's a complete myth. I think some of that is true, but the higher bar for me is what you think and how you feel about your child becomes their inner voice, right? If you are anxious around your child, if that's what you put out there, they will experience that as something's wrong with me. If you're disappointed, frustrated, right? And anxiety can just be a kind of a low-level presence. So it's our job to go take care of all those feelings, to manage all those things. That's what people in Al-Anon do. You know, they have these alcoholics, drug addicts in their lives, and they go to this place to take care of all this stuff. So then when they show up with the addict and the alcoholic in their life, who may or may not be in recovery, it doesn't spill out on them. Their addiction to getting their needs met through somebody else doesn't spill out on the addict or the alcoholic, who, by the way, is incredibly incapable of fulfilling that person's needs. Number 7, your child needs to know when they upset you so they will see the impact of their behavior on others. The I feel statement is an effective tool for behavior management, similar to what I was talking about before, versus the truth, which is how you feel is yours to own. Sharing your feelings in order to have your child feel responsible for fixing them is not healthy differentiation, right? It wires them to not know the difference between where they stop and where others start. They're erased, they're dismissed, they're turned into a thing that is there for your satisfaction. And that some of this language I'm using, I know it sounds extreme, and I don't mean it to. I don't mean it to be overwhelming, but that's the psychology of it. And number 8, well-behaved children come from good parenting, versus the truth, which is peace, contentment, serenity, clarity, and authenticity in the parent, are the results of good parenting. And those traits can have a wonderful impact on the child. Trying to think about the essence, and I wrote this today. Your role as a parent is to foster the development of a self. For that to occur, you must be in contact with your own authentic self. This goes beyond problem solving or getting it right, and it regards your child's feelings and their inner world as subjects that require your focus, attention, and respect. They are not here for you and for your needs, but it's the other way around. This requires that you take care of yourself and do not leave it up to others, especially your children. Right? They're the least capable, and as we learned from Alice Miller's work, they will be willing to develop a false self, to sacrifice the authentic, the real self, in order to take care of you. And that's a tragedy. It's a sadness. And it leaves them compromised for further relationships. It's as simple as that. So the take home, learn to listen, to hear them. Model feeling, model taking care of yourself. Right? Have a hobby that's not them. Have a place where you go to get fulfilled. Don't make that their job. Try to listen without judgment, right? For a therapist, we take it into the idea of being pragmatic. It's not that stealing is bad in a psychological sense. It's that it's evidence of some issues, right? Doesn't work. Something's broken in there that we need to look at. Without trying to fix it. Like Daniel Siegel says, a parent can provide healthy attachment from their child when their child expresses feelings and the parent doesn't feel the need to fix it. Without teaching them so much. There's so much of the work that I do is not about giving you better lectures. All this stuff is for you. In fact, rarely repeat any of this to your children unless you're repeating it to say, this is what I learned about me. But most of what I teach is the greater capacity to listen, to hear them, to listen and hear yourself, to explore your own childhood, to make sense out of it, to develop an authentic self so that you can be present and see and respond to and hold their authentic selves. And learn to do this listening, this empathy, this capacity without sacrificing your limits, your boundaries, your consequences. You still have the right to take care of yourself. You're not God. You don't have unlimited capacity. And because you don't have unlimited capacity, your children will have to learn to respond to an other themselves. They'll have to learn how to deal with frustration tolerance and delay of gratification and other people. Learn and practice the skills, the communication, the bachelors of communication that I talk about on the communication webinar, that I talk about in my book. You know, where your children are equal, you get to make decisions in your home, in your life when they're under 18. And that way, at the end of the day, you're the parent. That's not an equal thing. You're informed by their questions, by their feelings, by their needs. You're informed by that, but you make the decisions. And that way, there is not an equality. It's not a democracy, right? We don't get to have candy for breakfast because you want it. But where you all are equal is your feelings, right? That their feelings are as valid as yours. And really, they think the same thing a lot of the times about your feelings that you think about theirs, which is they're blaming, right? They don't understand it. They're misinformed. Their thinking is all screwed up. What does the reacting to another's emotions teach? Responsibility. You know, if we can learn, I was talking to a client today, in fact, they might even be on here. I was talking to a client today where they said that in a certain situation, if they had spoken their truth to a friend, that wouldn't go well. And we talked about that for a little bit because that's a sign that the relationship is compromised, right? Versus if I told you my truth in a decent way, then you could just hear it, respond to it, be empathic, adjust if you're able to without compromising yourself. You know, or does the reaction where we cut off or we fight or we become devastated by or defensive about, you know, is that fusion? Do we try to control other people's feelings? Do we think it's our job to make other people happy? Or that when other people are sad, it's our responsibility? Natural and logical consequences, boundaries instead of coercion, right? Don't use the emotional field to control or modify behavior. Use boundaries. And lastly, of course, do your own work. I wanted to share this, and I asked for permission. Shared it on social media. A parent shared this with me today, something they'd shared in one of their parent groups. And she writes, in the book, The Drama of the Gifted Child, Alice Miller writes, experience has taught us that there's only one enduring weapon in our struggle against mental illness, the emotional discovery of the truth about the unique history of our childhood. When I feel helpless as a parent, or I feel as if everyone else around me has it all figured out, I tend to say to my therapist, my manual for life got lost in the mail. Last week, she said to me, there is a handbook and a parenting manual inside of you. It's your experience of your childhood, and we need to keep looking back and making sense of it. If we don't end up processing things that happened in the past, we end up repeating patterns in our family and reliving our childhood experiences, reactions through our kids, and our kids will provoke an even bigger reaction from us of how intense it is to parent them. You might say, what good will looking back do? I believe we must look back in order to go forward. As scary as it seems, it's liberating. All right. Happy to take on any questions. What's the difference between being supportive and holding them accountable? For example, an overdrawn checking account and quit their job because of anxiety. That is a great, great, great question. And unfortunately, it's one that can only be answered through a series of other questions to you in therapy, really. Like, what is your intent? Right? The strange thing, if it comes from a place of control, you can never get it right. If it comes from authenticity, from all those positive traits, authenticity, support, love, not the dependent kind of love, but healthy love, then you will never get it wrong. So the difference is the intent. If it comes from control, from guilt, from shame, from fear, the difference is stepping off a curb because of guilt, fear, anxiety, control is wrong. Stepping off of a curb because you're being authentic, because your intent is to move along, to take a journey, then it's a healthy thing to do. So it's really in the sensibilities and the way that you are with your child, how you see them, how you see your relationship to their problems. So it's like I talk about in my book. When that parent asked me, should I give my child a cigarette? They asked for a cigarette, young adult child, when I came to visit them. Asked for the certain brand that they only sell in Canada. And I said, I could see you bringing a pack of cigarettes, handing it over to your child and saying, you know how I feel about smoking? Your grandfather died of smoking, but I'm not in control of it. So this is symbolically me letting go. And I could also see you showing up and saying, you can buy cigarettes on your own time if you want to. It's not my business. I'm not going to participate in buying them. Right? So the decision about whether you help with the overdrawn checking account isn't the question, right? It's in all the authenticity, all the work. Next question. I'm considering taking my older adult child into an intensive. Also, obviously, I have a need for some healing in our family caused by a variety of dysfunction. Excuse me. How you handle this given that the intensity of my own need versus seeing other. Excuse me. It's a good question. I think it's the right question to ask. The right question is be clear. Offer support. Ask for, I would like, this is my idea, this is what I would like, this is what I think it would accomplish. I'd like to invite you to participate in that. Would you be willing to? All of those things are okay, right? But getting clear, owning your own intensity, like you say, your own needs, and however the intense they are, when you start to be strategic, right? Manipulative about it, controlling about it, that's when it becomes a problem. But you can absolutely ask anybody in your life, your spouse, your child, this is what I'd like. This is how I'd like to support you. If you want to go to therapy, I'm happy to offer that. If you would like to come to an intensive, I'd love to. Right? I need help, and having you there might be even more helpful. But I need help. I need working on myself. But when you start thinking about fixing him or her, the other, that's when you get off track. All right, I'm going to go to upcoming events, and then we'll go back to questions at the end. We want all current families to attend 6 12-step support groups. Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous. You can also go to NAMI. That's not a 12-step support group, but you can go to NAMI for free education and resources in your area. Just try 6 of these support groups. Any version, any combination of 6. See if it fits for you. Follow us on social media. You can listen to all of these broadcasts on the podcast app. If you have an iPhone, an iOS device, use the podcast app and search Evoke Therapy Programs. If you have an Android device, download the SoundCloud app and search Evoke Therapy Programs. On Twitter and Instagram, follow us at Evoke Therapy. On Facebook, search Evoke Therapy Programs. You can also follow the Second Nature Alumni Foundation on Facebook. That's an organization of former parents who have created an organization to help people who can't afford therapy. You can also go to our blog. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon. Go to the other. Right now, it's temporarily. It's going to be restocked soon. the main Amazon library is out of stock. It's being reprinted. But if you go to the other options and you buy it there, it's for the same price and brand new editions of it from another warehouse. Also on barnesandnoble.com, or if you go to reaganarts.com, reaganarts.com, I'm going to actually put that on here. You can go and buy a copy of it there. You can also get an audio version or a CD version, or a Kindle version or a Nook version. Parent Alumni Foundation book page has my book, other books that therapists have recommended. It is available there, and you can, if you buy it through them, it's the same cost, and a percentage of the proceeds goes to help people who can't afford therapy. The next workshop, we want all current parents, if at all possible. We ask you, parents rave about this, come out to the parent workshop. You can combine it with a visit to your child in conjunction with it, if your therapist thinks it's appropriate timing. The next one is in our Cascades location, October 21st and 22nd. Contact Gail at Evoke Therapy for more information. We have an intensive next week that's full, so I didn't list it here. But after that, the next one is in November. Already a couple of people have signed up, so if you want to sign up, go there. Also, if you want to do a private therapy intensive, you can contact intensives@evoketherapy.com. Parent support groups, I will be in Washington, D.C. tomorrow night. And the Wilderness Play is playing this week at the Kennedy Center. So if you're anywhere near the area, it's there. It's also playing in a couple weeks in Nashville. So if you want to see, I think it's actually next weekend at the Oz Center in Nashville. I'll be in New York City on Sunday, October 29th in the afternoon. And then in Chicago, we haven't set the date yet. It'll be the week of November 13th. Pursuits trips are high adventure trips for young adults or families. Think of sober fun or therapy light with a strong adventure component. Any length of program, they can be custom anywhere from a few days to a couple of weeks or longer. International trips. They just got back from Nepal. I've shared that a couple of times. Any other questions? Parent writes, how can I learn to be authentic when I've been controlling and manipulative? Well, what I would say is get in line. You know, you're not, that's all of our work. See, the new Star Wars is going to come out. And the new Star Wars, I know it's supposed to be a sci-fi adventure, magical, spiritual journey, but it's a parenting book. It's a parenting movie. And there are two forces in the universe. There's the dark side, which is fueled by fear, which leads to control. And then there's the force, the light side, which is love and compassion. And so that battle that we're about to see again for the whatever 8th movie, 9th movie in the Star Wars saga, it's just trying to tell us about this that you just shared about, right? It's what we all struggle with. And the answer, how can I? There's very few tools, very few mediums that I know that are better than therapy and long-term therapy. Not when you're in a crisis, not to solve a problem. Right? Make sure that that's not what your therapist's project is about, but it's about developing a self, looking at your own history, looking at what's going on. And I've found in my own life, both as a therapist and as a client, that the ones who benefit the most are the ones who stay committed to it for years, because it's a process, right? It's a way of being. I was talking to my daughter today about a friend that could use therapy, and my daughter said everybody could use therapy. Everybody could benefit from therapy. So you do it in therapy. You do it by showing up here. You do it by attending webinars. And for those of you who might be new, if any of this sounds crazy, just stick with it a little while. It'll start to make sense after a while. All right, folks, time to wrap up. Next webinar will be Monday at the 16th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. I'll be talking about divorce, blended family, single parenting, and co-parenting. Have a great week. See some of you tomorrow night in Washington, D.C. Hope some of you get a chance to see the play in D.C. this week or in Nashville next week. Take care. Have a great time, and I'll talk to you on Monday. Bye-bye.